All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Unurbanist Assembly 2022. This is the Decriminalizing Drugs panel as a part of our Decarcerating Informal Economies segment, and we are excited to bring to you today a panel of subject matter experts who will be answering a set of prepared questions. And there will also be a Q&A portion after the recording. So keep your questions in mind or drop them in the chat. As a reminder, the purpose of the segment is to discuss the planning implications of harm reductive approaches to drug use and informal drug economies. We really thank you for joining us today, and we hope that you enjoyed this discussion. So I'm excited to pass it over to our first question today, which is to learn about the panel that we've invited to speak with you here today. So now I ask everyone to introduce themselves and their professional or personal relationship to the work. And if you can, please say your pronouns as well for the audience. Thank you. If you want to go first, Deborah, thank you.
Good evening. My name is Deborah Small. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm originally from New York, but I currently live in the East Bay in California. I've spent the last 25 years of my professional career as an advocate for not just decriminalizing, but ending the war on drugs, which in my mind means taking a regulated approach to currently illicit drugs in the same way we do with all other drugs. I believe that the drug war has caused more harm than good, and that's been particularly true for poor people and people of color, both in the US and globally. And I'm really happy to be part of this conversation this evening.
Thank you. Haven, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Haven Wheelock. I run the Drug Users Health Services Program at Outside in Portland, Oregon. So I do primarily direct service with people who are injecting heroin, methamphetamines, more recently fentanyl. I've been working in the field of harm reduction for nearly 20 years at this point. Which is wild and makes me feel old, but it's okay. I also was one of the chief petitioners on Oregon's decriminalization measures. So in 2020, Oregon became the first state in the United States to decriminalize the possession of small amounts of all substances. And I had the honor and pleasure and continue to do a lot of work around the implementation, getting that law passed, getting that change happening. And so I'm really committed to not only what's happening here in Oregon around decrim, but also how we can promote these policies across the country as well as across the planet. And it's a huge honor to be here today.
Thank you. And Queen, last but not least.
Hey everyone, my name is Queen Adustui. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a senior national policy manager with the Drug Policy Alliance. I'm really honored to be on a panel with OGs. I've been working in the space for 6 years as both a federal and local advocate to end the excited to be here.
All right, and thank you all for those beautiful introductions. I think now is a good time to get started. And again, if you have any questions that come up as you are hearing our panelists speak, you can feel free to save your questions to the end or drop them in the chat. Okay, so for first question, how has mass incarceration and policing contributed to the social exclusion and marginalization of substance users? So for this question, we really would like you to speak to the ways in which the specific examples or studies that have waged a war on drugs, as you've already mentioned, on Black and Brown, urban, and poor communities. And feel free to jump in.
I'll do it. I'll jump in. I mean, I think all of us on this panel can get on quite a soapbox about this in general. It's the work that we all do, but you know, the war on drugs was intended to incarcerate Black and Brown people. Like that was a known consequence. It was something that, like, it wasn't a mistake. It wasn't collateral damage. It was the intention of those policies and the white supremacy that is like baked into that. And so when we think about how like these policies are intentionally intended to harm communities, they are intentionally intended to like damage people, damage like the spirit of and like the bodies of people. It's just so clear that it's like foreverly going to be harmful, right? Like there's no way that these policies can be reformed in order for them to be fixed, because fundamentally they're doing exactly what they are intended to do, which is to like lock up people. And I think, you know, they're moving towards decriminalization isn't going to like end white supremacy, right? There's lots of different ways that it shows up, but it is something that we can do to create a more just society, is to move away from incarceration and policing. We like to otherize people who use drugs. We like to think of them as like those people over there, when in reality, like they are us. We are, I don't know what would happen to me if I didn't get my caffeine or my nicotine or my alcohol, but it wouldn't be pretty at this point in like my life. And so thinking through ways to like do something different is crucially important. And I'm not sure that that answered the question entirely, but that criminalization allows for like so many other ways of stigmatizing people, right? Like, you know, as long as we're still calling people criminals for their substance use, then we're going to continue to see medical providers treating people who use drugs differently than they would treat someone else. We're going to continue to see like the housing instability, and like we won't be able to end homelessness without getting rid of some of the stigma associated with drug use. And we can't get rid of the stigma until we stop criminalizing people.
Thank you.
Yeah, if I can just add, you know, mass criminalization and the war on drugs in general has been one of the biggest scams that our government has implemented. You know, the consistent campaigns to continue to stigmatize both drugs and the people who use them has been really successful in the ways that it's really devastated our communities. There was never any public health promises related to criminalizing drugs in terms of benefiting individuals or communities. But again, the last 50 years has really shown that incarcerating people for drug use worsens all individual and community health impacts. There's no way around it. There's no way to justify locking up a person who's assumed to have an addiction and like making that seem like that's actually would be helpful for this person. And I think the war on drugs does a good job at allowing policymakers to get away with doing nothing about a lot of the other social and economic issues that continue to worsen our communities and when it comes to safety and health. So we can focus on a person's drug use or make a person's issue with drugs more about them and not necessarily about the systemic issues that people are dealing with. So it's easy to ignore other really important issues that are also going unsolved. So I think the war on drugs, in the sense of wanting to actually promote public health, is something that definitely needs to end and needed to end a long time ago, just because it was really implemented as a political strategy and not one that was ever based in evidence or health or compassion. And I think also in general, as we move towards this generation of reimagining what public safety is, really getting away from the years of socialization around stigmatizing people who use drugs, is kind of the next frontier of what justice actually looks like. So as people grapple with, internalized stigma when it comes to drug use, we can start to see, we put that aside, we can start to see the ways that the best way to help a person is actually to meet them where they are. And I think an understated reality when it comes to drug use is that not everyone who actually uses drugs has an addiction. And the war on drugs makes it, seem as if you're in proximity to drugs, then you obviously have a problem. It's actually a minority of people who use illicit substances, and this is beyond cannabis, because I also think there's a misconception about that. Beyond cannabis, the majority of people who use illicit substances would not be categorized as having a substance use disorder. So, our whole way of addressing drug use and drug possession in this country really makes it harder for people who do need and want help to get that help, because of this assumption that anyone in proximity to drugs has an issue. And I think ultimately, even socially, we need to accept the realities that people use drugs, and people have always used drugs for years. And if we get away from this obsession with a drug-free society, we can actually focus in on what would actually make individual people and communities healthier and safer. And the last thing on that list would be incarcerating people, especially just for drug use and drug possession.
Thank you.
So I want to point out that we are having this conversation about drugs, and there are certain assumptions that underlie it. I think it's important to establish that we don't have a war on drugs or substances. We have a war on specific drugs and specific substances. The justification for having those things targeted or separated out and made illegal is based theoretically on their addictiveness and harmfulness. And yet the most addictive and harmful drugs that are commonly used by people, sugar, tobacco, alcohol, are not illegal substances. We tried at one point to make one of those illegal, alcohol, and that turned out to be a complete and total policy disaster. But I think it's important when you have this conversation to recognize that not only do we not have a war on drugs, because when it comes to consuming pharmaceuticals, we have a higher level of everyday consumption of all kinds of drugs than almost any other country in the world. So this isn't really about addressing drugs. It's about addressing specific substances that have been labeled as illicit by our government and made criminal. And when you look at the history of US drug policy, there's no question that the evidence is clear that the drugs that have been made illegal were made illegal for racist reasons. They were made illegal in order to justify the targeting of specific communities. So the first drug that was made illegal was opiates, and that was specifically done in order to be able to target the Asian community, which at that time was accused of using opiates as a way to be able to seduce and corrupt white women. Later on, we had the targeting of cocaine to be made illegal. Again, the justification was that this was a drug that was being abused by Black people, that it made them crazy, that under its influence, it caused them to rape and pillage and otherwise molest white women. So it was in the interest of public safety that this drug be made illegal and that those people be criminalized for using it. Similarly, cannabis, which was always referred to as cannabis and not marijuana until the laws were developed in order to target Mexican Americans, Hispanic populations, who were again charged with abusing this drug and under its influence, using it to attack and pillage and otherwise compromise the morals of white women. And so as a public safety matter, it was important to criminalize the drugs and heavily target those people who were suspected of using it. This history is important because it's not an accident that even though every drug that I just listed is used across population, similarly at every rate that the war on drugs has specifically targeted and been used as a tool to criminalize and incarcerate Black and brown people, because that was the intent. It was the intent then, it's the intent now. And what's particularly perverse about it, from my point of view, and the justification that's been given that this is being done in order to prevent addiction, is the fact that, again, historically, the US economy, the early colonial economy, was built on promoting addiction for profit, to sugar, to tobacco, to alcohol. Those were the crops on which the economy of the early colonies was based. It was for sugar and rum production that Black people were stolen from Africa and enslaved and forced to work. And so the idea that a country that built its wealth by promoting addiction for profit has now built a prison industrial complex based on punishing people for addiction is the height of perversity, absurdity, and just downright, what is the word? Hypocrisy. And I'll stop with that.
Thank you so much, Ms. Deborah. Queen or Haven, anyone have any reactions or responses for this question?
I could listen to Deborah talk all day long.
Yes, so can I.
I think she laid it out beautifully. I mean, it's unfortunate the way our policies are intentionally harming people. And I think what's even more unfortunate is how our government has been able to manipulate generations of people to believe that what we're doing is the right thing. So it's really important that, you know, we are now having more conversations about decriminalizing all drugs. Cannabis has led the way for that in a lot of ways. But it is about time that we actually talk about no longer arresting and punishing people for any drug.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would also say that like criminalization is also harming people's own self-perception, right? Like I get to sit with people every day who are using these substances and yes, the majority of the people that I am working with probably would be diagnosed with a substance use disorder. Not all, but many of them would be. And the shame and the guilt and the fear that like accompanies them in like how they access care from across the board, right? How they access services in general. Like they are excluded from shelters, like they can't stay in shelter because they can't get well while they're there. And they literally don't feel like they deserve to be treated with kindness. And like that is one of the most insidious things on all of this in my mind, is that these policies are designed to dehumanize people. And in that dehumanization, people start to believe it. Like as a society, we've like accepted that this is the way it is, and that's really bad. But to have and sit with people who like I regularly have conversations where when I say like I care about you, people don't believe that anyone could because of their substance use. And that makes it so much harder to see that you could have a different relationship with substances, right? Like if you don't think you are worthy of care and love because of your substance use, it's really hard to feel worthy of medicine to treat it, like a space to be in. And so, you know, beyond just like the actual like concrete measurable harms that we see by when we look at who's in prison for what, right? Like those things are easier. I think the like subtle ways that like we have been brainwashed to think about people who use substances, the way we think about what we do in order to keep people safe is incredibly damaging to both society as a whole, but also to the individuals who are using. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you, Haven. I'm gonna move forward to the next question, but I really like the framing that Ms. Deborah had of, you know, giving this a historical lens. Today we're here to also talk about, you know, the relationship between this topic of decriminalizing drugs and land use and planning, the topic of urbanists and why we're here today. So For our next question, we're wondering if you can speak to the direct or indirect relationship between land use patterns and the criminalization of drug use. So if you could speak to ways in which the cost of housing, perhaps, or spatial exclusion, or the rise in houselessness, and how that has further stigmatized drug use.
My initial response to this actually bleeds in from the last question, because the ways that our drug policies continue to punish people even when they're no longer incarcerated feeds into how they're excluded from our society and how it really does disproportionately impact the most under-resourced in our communities. So folks who have the least amount of resources really feel the impact of these policies the most. So for example, there are thousands of collateral consequences which are not really that collateral. They're really, like we mentioned, intentional to harm people. But the ways that having a drug conviction can impact your ability to keep housing or even get housing if you didn't have it already, to keep your job, to get a job, to keep your kids, to stay in this country for folks who are non-citizens. The list goes on. And there are so many different aspects of systems separate from the criminal legal system that make it difficult for people to operate in if they have a drug conviction or if they are dealing or in recovery. So, when we talk about unhoused folks, the perverseness of criminalizing them for activities that people are freely able to do when they're indoors in homes that they are able to be privileged to be in, it's, really devastating. In DC, the last year or two, actually, there's been a huge war against people who are unhoused. The ways that sweeps have been going on with no regard to people's belongings, to people's experiences, to whether or not a person will actually still be able to get housing after certain raids of communities. It's beyond insidious. And that's why I think, drug use in conversation with all of these pieces makes it easier to dispose of people. And policymakers often, see their constituents not including folks who are unhoused, and oftentimes not even including people who use drugs. So, when we have these movement conversations, it isn't really important for folks who fight for housing justice to incorporate drug policy and harm reduction into their praxis. Because, when movements move in silos, the most vulnerable at the center of everything, which honestly, we're all fighting for the same folks, people can be left behind and things can fall through the cracks. So for folks who are invested in making sure that housing justice actually happens, it's important to realize the ways that the war on drugs plays a part in disconnecting people from a home, or disincentivizing policymakers from caring about people who need homes, especially if they're people who use drugs.
So I want to, again, address some of the common myths that are associated with drugs, particularly in this country. When people think about who uses drugs, people generally associate it with poor people, with marginalized people, with people of color. And yet the reality is that the average drug user in America is not a person of color, is not poor. It's a person with a job that goes to work every day. The majority of people who use illicit drugs are not poor. And how do we know this? Because the illicit drug market is a multi-billion-dollar market. If all the poor people in America were spending all their money just on drugs, collectively, we don't have enough money to support that market. And so just objectively, not getting into anything else, the biggest myth is that this is something that's being done primarily by poor and marginalized people. That's not true. Now, the war on drugs is a war that's being fought against poor and marginalized people, but it is not being fought against the majority of the people who are drug users, or even the majority of the people who are involved in the drug market. Another point of fact, When we think about who's involved in the illicit drug trade, people tend to think of the guy on the street who's selling $25, $100 worth of an illicit drug. Very rarely do we ever think of bankers. And yet you cannot have a successful drug business without having a place to launder your money. And in order to do that, you need banks. There's not a single major bank that's operating and doing business in this country that has not, at some point in the last 20 years, paid a fine for knowingly laundering drug money. That's just a fact. But the other thing I think it's really important to remember when we're talking about this is that drugs are a global market. And the same drugs that we're currently prosecuting people for as illicit and addictive were also the same drugs that people were making money from. So again, this is not ancient history. The British fought a war with China to force them to accept opium, which they were getting from their Indian colony, and forcing the Chinese to buy. Why? Because the Chinese weren't interested in any of the other things that the British had to sell, and they did not want to have to pay money for the tea and silks and other things that they were getting, called the Boxer Wars. That was a war foisted on that country to force them to take the very kind of drugs that we're now locking people up for. Similarly, in Latin America, one of the major reasons that we have a problem with quote unquote immigration, people leaving their country and coming to ours, is because of the war on drugs. Because drug prohibition has made coca and opiates and cannabis more valuable than any other legitimate crop that you can grow anywhere in Latin America. We have made it harder for regular farmers to be able to have a viable business because they can't grow anything that's going to be more valuable on the market than illicit drugs, because that's the price of prohibition. And then as a country, we are the ones who consume the majority of those products and yet take no responsibility for that. Instead, our foreign policy allows us to invade and punish the countries that are quote unquote producers of a product that we're buying, with no accountability whatsoever for the fact that they're feeding US demand. So Honduras, Panama, El Salvador, Mexico, Colombia have all suffered from all kinds of violence, drug-related violence, because of our policy of drug prohibition. And so I think we need to really think about the fact that this is a policy that not only is not working for people here in the US, it's not working for people anywhere. It's one of the major reasons that former President Duterte in the Philippines has been able to kill thousands of poor people under the guise of the war on drugs. It's what's helping to fuel the continuation of the wars in Afghanistan and Syria. It's the reason why increasingly more and more people have to leave their homes and their villages throughout the Isthmus Peninsula and come here fleeing from the violence that is specifically generated by the war on drugs. So for me, decriminalization, yes, that would be a good step, but that would still leave us the problem of drug production, drug distribution. It just says we wouldn't punish people who were users. Well, that's a great position for us to say because we're not the ones who are producing. It still allows us to justify using criminal penalties against the people who we claim are producing these drugs, which is why we need to end prohibition altogether and develop a policy of regulation and control.
Yes, to all of that. I also want to call out, like, when we're thinking about land use and drug use, right? Like, the war on drug users is being targeted in urban areas. It's being targeted towards Black and brown people. But yet, where are the prisons? They are not in those communities. Where are the jobs that come with the prisons, right? And so, you know, we here in Oregon with our decrim stuff, along with like decriminalizing possession, we also are regulating a large amount of cannabis money to treatment and harm reduction. And while that money hasn't landed in my lap yet. I can't use it. It's promised. And I'm like, in really thinking about like how I spent a lot of time like talking about and thinking about county by county here in Oregon, who has been most affected by the war on drugs. And there are a lot of places that the war on drugs was like incredibly beneficial to them, right? Small rural communities that when logging went away, now they built this giant prison to like lock people up. And with those prisons came good jobs. And the people that work in those prisons tend to look like me, right? And so, thinking about, and they talk about this in like the new Jim Crow too, about how where we vote, like where we get counted in the census is something that like changes policy. So if we take a whole bunch of people who are living and are from urban communities, move them to the far west corner of our state where there's not a lot happening, now that population in that community is bigger, and yet those people still can't vote. Like mostly incarcerated people here in Oregon, I know, cannot vote. So like thinking through how and where these things are and why they are there. Like, why did they put, like, yes, some of that, like some of the decisions to put prisons in rural communities, some of that is because we want to isolate people, which is wrong, but that is part of it. But the other thing is they want to build those communities and they want to bolster like those parts of the state. And I think that is something that we don't talk enough about, is like who benefits, because people do benefit. Not the right people, but the other thing Queen was talking about, like homeless sweeps and things like that. Here in Oregon, actually drug use is a reason for them to sweep camps. Like it is documented in city like documents that you have to have so many complaints. Here are the things you can complain about in order to get a camp swept. And evidence of drug use is one of the quickest ways to, we spend a lot of time talking to clients about how to make sure all of their little orange caps are inside their tent at all times, because even seeing one or two orange caps, which are not at all dangerous, litter's bad in all regards, but they're not a health threat in any way. Discarded syringes are not dangerous. They're gross and they're litter and we shouldn't litter. But because of our panic around drug use and the acknowledgement that people might be using drugs in those spaces, we see people freak out if there's a syringe on the sidewalk, even though it's a piece of plastic that is not going to bite you. And like, using drug use as an excuse to move people along, to like banish folks, to break up community is just really gross. And one other thing I wanted to touch on is like, I think a lot about like design and like how we build communities. And like, that's kind of like the thing with this conference. But I think because of how we treat and stigmatize people who use substances, it also allows us to not invest in health-based design. It like, we don't, like, we know there's like trauma-informed like building, right? There's trauma-informed design where we know that like having good light and ventilation is healing for folks. Having like pretty things and art and plants makes people feel more human and like improves healing. And yet when you look at drug detox centers, when you look at drug treatment centers, like unless you're real bougie or got the real good insurance, like they are not pretty places to be, right? And like I think about it myself, like my office and my like syringe service program is probably the least pretty of all of the buildings at my organization. And some of that is because I'm terrible at making things pretty. But I also question, like, why is it that we had beautiful design and construction when we built our main building, our primary care clinic, our housing program, and yet my space where people are coming to use drugs Like I had to fight to get art on the wall because of like a misconception that if we put something on the wall, it's gonna get stolen. And not to say things don't get stolen out of our space, because they do. But like, does that make it okay for it to not be a welcoming place? Does it make it okay for us to like not create a space for folks to feel safe and cared for? And I think in thinking about space and thinking about drug use, I think that's part of why like there's so much pushback about overdose prevention sites and harm reduction sites in general, is because the war on drug users has told us that these people don't deserve a safe space. They don't deserve safety. They don't deserve care. It makes it really hard for no one on this panel, but in general, for people to be like, yeah, I want my tax dollars going to a building where people are using drugs, right? And like, it's overdose prevention sites are good healthcare. They are good spaces. They are evidence-based. They are important. And the fact that like they've been operating globally for 40 years and 6 months in the US is slightly appalling. And I do think it comes back to this like dehumanization of people that prohibits these spaces in so many places.
Just 3 quick comments. 1, again, it depends on what places, what spaces, what drugs. I can think of a place that's commonly used by a lot of rich men who are regularly using drugs, also known as Cialis. They're called country clubs. I don't see anybody having a problem with making those things pretty. Art. We go to buildings full of stolen art. They're called museums. No one has a problem with using their tax money to support the preservation of that stolen art. And the final point I want to make is that being a prison guard may be a better paying job than working at McDonald's or some other minimum wage job, but it is not a good job. People who work in prisons, I say the main difference, they're still spending their life in prison. The difference is that they get a chance to go home at night. But in terms of being in a space that's ugly, that's dehumanizing, that's brutal, that brings out the worst in people, that's what prisons do, whether you're there as a prisoner or you're there as a keeper of prisoners. And so we want to really question the overall design of an economy that will replace dull, repetitive, physically demanding manufacturing jobs with equally soulless, dehumanizing prison jobs. What that tells you is that there's no care whatsoever about workers in that economy. And so I say that, you know, part of what we need to be fighting for, particularly those of us who want to address the problems that are plaguing urban communities, is for some economic democracy. Our political democracy is in trouble, but we measure nowhere on the scale of economic democracy. And yet so many of the problems that we're talking about, which has to do with the investment of public monies, is the result of that lack of economic democracy and the ability for us to put our resources where we know they should be and not where the plutocrats tell us they should be.
Thank you, Ms. Deborah, and thank you to you all. I think, you know, as planners and as architects and urban designers and people that are policymakers that are in this work, we really have a responsibility to, you know, contribute to the beautification of these spaces and to take away that stigma. Because again, to your point, Haven, it really does affect how people view themselves, you know, when they are in these physical spaces, you know. I want to go to our next question. For folks that are new to this topic, or for folks that are maybe not familiar, or maybe they're still on the fence about harm reduction. First, I want to ask if someone in their own words could explain what harm reduction means to you. And then if you could speak to the barriers that we must overcome to transition from a criminalization approach to a harm reductive approach.
Yeah, I'm happy to take a stab. So harm reduction for me does not have to only apply to drug use. Harm reduction is a philosophy, it's a practice. Oftentimes people don't realize all the harm reduction tools we have in our daily lives. Driving is unsafe, using a seatbelt is harm reduction, a helmet is harm reduction, sunblock is harm reduction. It's anything that you can use or do to reduce the harm associated with anything is technically harm reduction. In the context of drugs, harm reduction looks like one, meeting people where they are, and providing people either resources, a space, an ear, anything a person may need that may help them reduce the harm associated with their drug use or their situation. So housing is harm reduction. Oftentimes people only think about syringe exchange or fentanyl testing kits or even overdose prevention centers as harm reduction, which they all are harm reduction. But really seeing the fullness of a person and providing them economic or social support to get beyond where they want to be is harm reduction. Harm reduction is love, loving people. Speaking to what Haven mentioned earlier, like allowing people to see love in themselves is harm reduction. Leadership, supporting the leadership of other peers, especially in the drug-related space, is harm reduction. And frankly, drug decriminalization is harm reduction. I really appreciated Deborah opening up with the fact that the goal actually is not just decrim, it's about regulating substances. And even beyond that, really repairing the harms of this whole thing is all a part of it. But drug decriminalization is not going to end the war on drugs. It's a huge step. It's a huge step, and it's a really important step because a lot of people are dying. But until we have a regulated supply, people will actually continue to die. And harm reduction is the way that we reduce that the amount of people who are dying. But until we can actually get to the place where we have sound conversations about evidence-based approaches, we're not going to get to a place where we can, safely say that we can actually eliminate the harms, because a lot of the harms associated with drug use are often, I wouldn't want to say predictable, but can be mitigated. But our policies get in the way of actual evidence-based policies. So harm reduction is really the fullness of either a person or a situation, and meeting a person or a situation where it is or where they are.
I don't know who I stole this from. Like whenever we talk about harm reduction, I know I stole it from someone because I'm not that clever, but when you ask somebody what is harm reduction, and everyone's always going to say it's about meeting people where they're at. And I've taken to saying it's about meeting people where they're at and not leaving them there, right? Like, yes, we need to show up for people wherever they're at along their continuum of life. We need to stay with them, right? Like harm reduction is not a passive intervention. I think that is one of the major barriers I see and hear in talking about how to adopt harm reduction approaches, is that like people tend to think we're just like slinging needles in naloxone, which I am a very proud naloxone slinger. I am fine with that title, but it's also it's an active intervention, right? Like we are constantly engaging with our participants around whatever they want, whether it's their health, whether it's just like talking shit about the police, right? Like we spend a lot of time talking shit about the police in our spaces. But it's really just like, it is active engagement. It is not, I can't be replaced by a vending machine. I will not let anyone, like I am pro harm reduction vending machines. If you want a naloxone vending machine, that is great. And I'm not a robot. You can't replace me with a robot. You can't replace our staff with a robot, right? We are trained to know like how people are using drugs. We are constantly learning from our participants as like drug supplies are changing and things like that are happening. Like what's out there, what's happening, how are people using? And like, while I love my colleagues who are in long-term recovery and doing a lot of work, you know, and I don't cringe when people are like, oh, I have this much time of sobriety or whatever. Okay, I cringe a little bit. But truth be told, for most like of the recovery peers in our community, most of them have never used drugs in the time of fentanyl, right? Like fentanyl has only been in like our drug supply here, like really maybe the last 18 months, which is very different than most of the country. And so like, there are different tools and different information that we need to share with folks regarding these substances and how they are changing and like what we know about them. And so like, I really think the barrier of like it being viewed as just these tools of harm reduction, right? New syringes, those are a tool of harm reduction. Naloxone is a tool of harm reduction. But harm reduction as a whole is more than just its tools. It is about that active engagement. It is about showing up for people and helping them feel connected to something, to like empower their voices, to like be like, to drive decisions both for like their own lives, the policies in which we operate our services in, and centering their like national, state, and like national policy should have drug users helping us shape those policies. And that to me is really where the beauty of harm reduction is that we like acknowledge that these people are the experts in their lives. They are the experts in what they need. They may not fully understand how hepatitis C is transmitted. And so I might get to like give some nudges around like, hey, if you do it this way, you're less likely to get this thing, right? And that is important work, but it is about like being present with and sitting with folks. And if I could see anything change, honestly, it was like this idea that harm reduction is like, it is on the continuum of care for people who use drugs, right? Like we need all the stuff from like harm reduction to long-term recovery supports to housing. Like we need that full continuum of care for folks. And even if you don't have a substance use disorder, you may never need treatment. But the cocaine I'm going to do next weekend, I'm going to want new straws for so that I don't like spread infection and I don't get COVID. Right. And just like really like, if I'm going to be smoking my drugs, I need to have safe smoking supplies. I just do, especially in the time of a respiratory pandemic when sharing pipes is incredibly dangerous. So yeah, to me, it's really thinking about like how we show up for people, how we engage with people. And I think it's something that gets missed a lot in the conversation is just how active doing harm reduction work is, and like how skilled the people doing this work really are in ways that are different than they just are in recovery from substances. It is a different set of skills that is specialized. And the other thing about harm reduction that I love the most is it was started and founded, like these concepts and these practices come from people who use drugs. It long before public health gave a rat's ass about like the work of harm reduction, it was people who use drugs getting syringes and giving them to their friends, right? The first naloxone access all happened illegally when some naloxone might have fallen off the back of an ambulance, right? Like, and drug users have always taken care of each other in that way. They always have, they always will. And to think that this is like a public health intervention now without honoring the shoulders of the giants we stand on is a big misgiving, because like they're more badass and brave than I ever was.
Harm reduction is a response to the harms that are caused by our drug policies. I think it's really important that we start from that place and that we think about why this is necessary. People, we don't see people dying from tobacco intoxication. They may die from cancer related to tobacco use, but they're not dying from tobacco intoxication. We have labeling on alcohol. The majority of people who drink don't buy overproof alcohol. What does that say? People read labels to see how much sugar is in the products that they buy in the store if they're diabetic or have any other sensitivity to sugar. So what is it that's going on here? Our drug policies have made the use of certain drugs potentially fatal. It's not the drugs, it's the policies. If people had the choice, they would use opiates in the least concentrated fashion, at the smallest level, in the safest way. If people had the choice, they would use cocaine, coca, leaves, tea in the most safest way. Our drug policies are what make the things harmful. So I feel like it's important to recognize that, because we talk about harm reduction as if it's the drugs that people have to be protected from, as if it's the drugs that are causing the harm, when in reality, it's our policies about those drugs that are causing the harms that we then have to respond to with a set of tactics and tools we call harm reduction. But for me, it's really important to be clear about what it is that we're talking about and what it is we're doing. It's like, in the same way that as a Black person, I have to hold the diametrically opposed realities that race is not real. It's an artificial construct made up to support people who were profiteers. And at the same time, racism is real and it affects my life every day. I got to hold on to those two things, which are diametrically different, but both valid and true. Same thing here. These drugs are not in and of themselves harmful. And if people had the choice and the ability, they would use them in the least harmful way. Now, are there some people who are prone to abuse them? Yes, in the same way that there are people who are prone to abuse alcohol, to abuse sugar, to gamble. I mean, there are people among us who are prone to be excessive in any behavior. That's what behavioral science is all about. But we have chosen as a society not to criminalize the majority of those excesses. And with drugs, we criminalize whether it's excessive or not, just because. So the problem is not with the substances. The problem is with us and the way in which we've construed and given these substances a life of their own. They're evil, they're predatory, they're coming for us. No, they're plants. And the reason that's important is because science, this is the thing, and if people don't remember anything else I say, remember this: the future of drugs is synthetics. The future of drugs are synthetics. Every drug that is currently plant-based today, there will be a synthetic derivative of tomorrow, which means it will be impossible to eliminate supply when it can be concocted in any laboratory anywhere in the world. So we got to let go of this conversation that has us believe it's the substances. We cannot control them. It's our relationship to the substances that has become perverted, in the same way that our relationship to people's skin color has become perverted in a way that's just fucking up the world. Excuse the way I'm talking. So like, that's the part that needs to change. Those are the harms we have to reduce: our thinking and the way that we see things, not the plants, not the substances.
Thank you, Ms. Deborah. I'm wondering, before we move on,
Can
For
I ask
folks-
a follow-up question real quick?
Yes, for sure.
I don't disagree with you, Deborah, that we're moving to an all synthetic drug world at all. And I'm curious do you think that that is because of the fact that our planet is dying because capitalism is creating a climate disaster and we won't be able to grow these plants anymore? Or do you think it's more because it's just cheaper and more effective to make drugs?
The second. Okay, it's the second. Because again, this is a business. It's a global business. It's a global market. The reason it's happening is because you can literally bring one cargo container of fentanyl enough to kill everybody in the whole country in one shipment. Why travel with opiates when you can do that? Okay, and as long as it's illicit, as long as it's illegal, the incentive for the people in the market is to find the most concentrated, smallest amount possible, easiest to transport. So the very model that we've incentivized by having an illicit market, I'm gonna give you guys a quick example of what I mean that folks can relate to. So this last week, they've been celebrating the 20th anniversary of The Wire, which I think is one of the most brilliant programs that's ever been on television. And it's actually relevant to this conference because it's about urban life at the beginning of the millennial. It's set in Baltimore, a city that exemplifies a host of urban ills, from the environment to lack of education, to poor policing, to addiction. All of those subjects are covered. Deindustrialization, all of those subjects are covered in The Wire. But one of the things that David Simon got right, and he got a lot of things right, but one of the things that he got right that illustrates what I'm talking about is that when he first started writing about Baltimore and putting it on TV, his first show was called Homicide: Life on the Street. And the drug dealer there was in the business, but he also ran a community center. His name was Luther something. And so on one hand, he was, the neighborhood drug guy running that thing, but he also ran a community program that employed people, that had programs for kids, blah, blah, blah. By the time you get to The Wire, the guy, Barksdale, the first guy, he's running a drug cartel, but he's also kind of into the community. So he's willing to finance the guy who wants to open a boxing ring. He finances the local basketball clubs, etc. He feels like, yeah, I may be making my money from drugs, but I also got some investment. I got family. I got people I care about. By the time you get to the end of The Wire, Marlowe is a complete and total sociopath. He has no family, no relationship to anybody, to the community, to a person, to nothing. And that's one of the consequences of the drug war, of taking out each generation of person who may have had a connection. They may have been in the business, but they also had a connection to the community. But we took them out and we locked them up for 15 years, 20 years, 25. And the people who survived were the ones who were more ruthless, who were less connected, who didn't give a damn about anything but the Benjamins. This is what we're doing. This is what the drug war does. This is what those policies do. And for those of you who haven't seen the series, I highly recommend it, not just for the story itself, but for all the amazing actors, who, found their voice in those characters. And I'll stop with that.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Deborah. As a Baltimore City native, I am very appreciative of you bringing The Wire up. I want to go to our final question today. And I want to ask with this question that maybe if, when you all give your remarks, if you could speak to specific examples that you've seen that for folks, again, that are new to this topic can look up and research more if they want to learn. But for our final question, we're interested in what role or what decisions or can policymakers and urban planners and designers play in implementing harm reductive approaches in their work? So again, if you could cite any examples that have been successful any approaches, any housing models or community engagement strategies for tapping into this community that you can speak to, that would be great. Thanks.
Well, I mean, similar to this last question, I think my answer kind of bleeds in from the last question, whereas like one of the barriers and one of the opportunities for policymakers and urban planners and designers really is to stop operating from a place of without. I feel like there's always money for things that don't help people, and there's never money for things that saves lives. Like, I feel like just oftentimes when harm reduction is implemented in certain cities, it's not necessarily funded in the way that it needs to be, or even just non-punitive approaches to even addressing violence, for example. There are several cities that have been looking into violence interrupters and taking law enforcement out of the approaches when it comes to even what people define as violent crime. These alternatives oftentimes are not supported financially in the same ways that enforcement usually is, or war, or things that harm people. So I would say policymakers should stop aligning themselves with issues that they don't truly support if they're not going to actually back it. Because I think oftentimes harm reduction is, for lack of a better word, sexy now. Like, it's something that people feel comfortable aligning themselves with, but when it comes to the root of it, they oftentimes are not actually there. So, I mean, an example of a harm reduction being implemented when I think of at least the criminalization side is actually Baltimore again. Shout out to Baltimore State Attorney Marilyn Mosby, who has stopped prosecuting drug possession charges and actually other low-level offenses, including sex work, since 2020, since the height of the pandemic. And Johns Hopkins University researchers put out a report really evaluating that policy, which I would consider a harm reduction policy in the height of COVID, but really should have been something that happened outside of the pandemic. But of course, all the things that we know would happen happens. There were no increases in public safety issues related to drug use or public safety issues in general, actually, with that policy. And I think if we can actually invest in the evidence research and policy recommendations that folks like Deborah and Haven have literally been talking about for years, we actually may be able to see progress. I don't know how they don't get frustrated having spent so much time saying the same thing over and over again, watching the consequences of ignoring these recommendations over the years. There's not much that has changed in the recommendations beyond things having to adapt because of the changes in the market. Most of what folks are talking about are the same things that folks have been talking about for decades, since I was a child. So I think policymakers just need to actually be about it. And I think, health needs to be less partisan. And I also just think that politicians need to stop making health a political game. And I think in terms of urban planners and folks who are really building up communities, I think part of that work, I'm not sure if it's the work of the designers or, I think it's a collective issue and something we need to fight for, is making sure that NIMBYism isn't continuing to get in the way of resources and life-saving things that we actually need in our communities. So it goes back to fighting against stigma. It goes back to humanizing people. But again, it's in a country where we don't even have healthcare, in a country where we're still fighting for reparations, for a whole host of issues, including back to enslavement. It's hard to see how all of this is going to pan out, because at the end of the day, people profit from these systems, as we've been talking about. So ultimately, I would say actually being about what you claim you support, the principles you claim you support, and funding it fully.
So I want to give a few examples of harm reduction at different levels. Most of them outside of the US, but not exclusively. So I'm going to start with one. I'm going to refer back again to The Wire. There was a famous story in season 2 or 3, I believe, where one of the police captains decided that he was going to do his own experiment with drug decriminalization. And he kind of set up this zone in the city where people could buy and sell drugs without being arrested. And they nicknamed it Amsterdam because it was modeled after the experiment in Amsterdam, which was then a decrim zone. But in the Wire version of it, it became this really scary place with people walking around kind of out of it and beating each other up until they brought in health people. But it was really kind of like very dystopian. I actually went to a real pilot program like that was in Brazil, in Sao Paulo, called Open Arms, that was a decriminalized zone specifically designed for crack users. The local nickname for it was Crackolandia. And what was really interesting about it was that the zone, which was decriminalized, was right next to, had right in the middle of it, a government-built public health center. But all around, across from it, was like the harm reduction community-based drop-in area. What was so amazing is, like, unlike on the televised version in the US, there was nothing scary about being in this area. People were out and about doing their business, you know, eating food, buying food, washing clothes, talking to each other, using drugs, selling drugs, blah, blah, blah. They all lived in this area. The police were outside the area, so if anything happened, they were nearby, but they weren't actually inside. But the most interesting thing was that it was such an experiment in choice, because anybody in that area could go into the government-funded healthcare building for services, for treatment, for anything. Or they could go to the harm reduction drop-in center, which had very little money, but was peer-based. The government building was totally empty. The hours and hours that I spent there, I never saw a single person go in or out. Because when given the choice, people would rather go to a place where they were treated as humans, where they weren't going to get coerced services, where they weren't going to be written down in a book, you know, for potential surveillance later on. They would prefer to go to a place that was created by their peers and was friendly for them. So that was a great experiment for me. Of course, that was before Bolsonaro, so the program isn't there anymore. I also got a chance to see a heroin maintenance program in Switzerland, where people who had been longtime heroin users for whom regular treatment didn't work could actually get medically grade heroin from the government in a health facility that was clean, and where they were encouraged to smoke it instead of injecting it because that was safer. What was the most interesting thing to me about the Swiss experiment in heroin maintenance was that they had a higher success rate of people who stopped using drugs altogether than have been experienced in most American coerced treatment. Because when people no longer had to deal with the chaos-inducing factor of having to chase drugs every day, and were able to begin to order their lives because they had a regular supply, which wasn't going to make them sick or whatever, they could think about what else they wanted to do, which for many people was like, hey, I want to get this monkey off my back and live a different way. But that was by giving them what they wanted, not by trying to force them to be different. I thought that was a great lesson. Canada has had a similar program now going on in Vancouver with similar success. And quiet as it is, most Americans don't know that in the very earliest days of Prohibition here, we had morphine maintenance programs in the US during the first 12 to 15 years of Prohibition, where people could get legal drugs in a health setting. But we act like now, like that's the most radical thing in the world to even consider, because we are so ahistorical in this country. Fourth, harm reduction intervention, healthy prisons. I know that sounds like an oxymoron, but I've actually been in what one could call a healthy prison, where people wear their own clothes, where they're called by their names, not numbers, where they make their own food and they make their own rules, because there are some countries like New Zealand and Norway that believe that just taking away a person's freedom is punishment enough. You don't have to dehumanize them. You don't have to control them. You don't have to make them feel like they're constantly second class, third class as an additional form of punishment. And in those environments, people really can focus on rehabilitation, and they don't keep them there forever because they recognize that people have our lives are finite. So they don't give away sentences like pieces of candy like we do here. That's all things that we could do that would be harm reduction approaches. But I want to give two examples right in the US. One, many years ago, I had the honor of being chair of a women's treatment program in Harlem called Green Hope Services. And it already at that point had over a 30-year history of providing drug treatment for women. And during that time, we were able to get up enough money, et cetera, to build a new facility where women could actually have their children living with them while they were receiving treatment. Because one big inhibition for women to access treatment is the idea that they have to be separated from their children. So we were able to take a building and redo it in a way that they could live there with their kids. The biggest fight that we had, other than the NIMBYism and in the community, was with the design people who fought us because we wanted the building to look beautiful. We had this, really nice design that was inspired by Ndebele buildings in South Africa, which is like geometric and, colorful. And they were like, why should we spend money on this? And we're like, because it's a residence. Why shouldn't it look like a home? And that speaks to what you were saying, Queen, and what you were saying, Haven, about this orientation that somehow poor people don't deserve anything beautiful. That kids, regardless of that they don't deserve something that looks nice, that you should be so grateful that you're getting anything, that it shouldn't matter how it looks, even though it matters for us. And I'll never forget where I used to live in Harlem on 129th Street. A few blocks away was a school, and the building was a square, and it had no windows. I was so disgusted because they had the audacity to name the school after Arthur Schomburg, the founder of the first Black library collection. Who sends a kid to a building with no windows? A city that believes that they're preparing them for prisons. So all you have is the same kind of artificial lighting and concrete, et cetera, that you would see behind bars, because the design reflects your mindset. The design reflects what you feel. I'm here in California where we don't have, schools with no windows. We just got schools with no trees, schools that look run down. That's how you know it's a poor neighborhood, because the school looks like no one's paid any attention to it for the last 20, 25 years. But my last harm reduction suggestion for all of you who live in states like mine where people drive, we should have naloxone distribution and training at the Department of Motor Vehicles office. Almost everybody who drives ends up at the DMV at some point. You are always there for at least 15 to 20 minutes. They all got TV screens, long enough to do some basic thing. And this is my thing. It's like, if you want to take the stigma away, treat overdose prevention like CPR, something that everyone should know, because you never know when you may be called upon to save a life. So if you did it at the DMV, you would normalize it. You would get us past this way of thinking that we know who the drug users are. We know who the people are who may, be at risk of overdose. Because if we did know that, we wouldn't be so shocked when star after star after star that we love drops dead. And we're like, oh my God, how could that happen? Because we think we know. No, we don't know. And then the final thing is that we need to stop using the term overdose, to me, because it sounds like something people do to themselves. And what's really happening right now is most folks are dying of fentanyl poisoning. They're poisoned. That's different. People don't choose to be poisoned. And I think if we called it what it is, which are accidental poisonings, folks might have a different set of responses. because then it wouldn't be like, oh, this person took too much of something. No, they were poisoned. They didn't choose this. And fentanyl is showing up in everything. And unless we're going to test all these drugs for people, then we need to call their deaths what it is, poisonings. And we need to have responses that are sufficient to that, which would then make opiate distribution, safe consumption spaces a no-brainer, because they'd definitely be things you'd want to do to protect people from being accidentally poisoned.
Deborah, I'm going to steal. So I'm currently working on legislation here in Oregon around mandatory, not mandatory, requirements for naloxone in different places. Do you mind if I steal this whole idea that the DMV is pumping it out there?
No, I've been trying to get a state to do that since Governor, what's his name, of Vermont declared a state of emergency, Shumlin, I think, all those years ago, because I really think that particularly in rural states, that this is a great way of getting it out there, you know, and like I said, of normalizing the idea of this intervention as something that everyone should know how to do.
Yes, I love it. And I will give you credit when I propose it to the legislature folks that I am meeting with later this week. And to something Queen was saying, or I think it was Queen that was saying it earlier, like about funding services, right? You know what people believe in and you know what they think is important by what they budget for, right? There's never a problem finding a jail bed. There is definitely problems finding treatment beds. Like, I don't know any state in this country. I mean, Oregon is known for being last for access to like treatment services for folks that need it, for mental health and addiction services. But I would venture to guess there's nowhere in this country where it is not harder to get into treatment for substance use disorder than it is to get into jail. And that comes down to funding and prioritization, right? Like there's no reason we couldn't fund treatment that same way, right? We got the money, but we just won't. In terms of the actual questioning of what policymakers, planners, designers can do around harm reduction, the first thing you can do is talk to people and actually listen to them, right? Like if you're working on a policy that is going to have impacts for any community, including the drug using community, have a conversation, listen to them, right? Like people are an expert in what they need. They don't need like, I mean, if you're not going to actually talk directly to people who use drugs, then I'll talk to you, right? Because I want you to listen, but it is better if you get to talk to the people who are using the drugs. That will help shape how to do this work, whether that is planning, you know, a shelter for folks, right? Whether that is planning services specifically for people who use drugs, whether that's planning a policy that is going to like impact community, you need to talk to those people and you need to listen to them and believe them. If they say this is not what they want, don't do it because it's not going to work, right? I think we need to be brave. I think that so much of like the problems we have in like getting harm reduction into our communities is that people are scared. One, they're scared of people who use drugs because of all of the stigma, because of the messaging around the war on drugs and all the things that we were taught, right? About people who use drugs that are just false. I like a lot of people who use all kinds of drugs. So one, be brave enough to talk to them and listen to them. Also be brave enough to stand up to like the people who, the NIMBYs of the world who are like, we don't want you here. We don't care about these people. But I also think it's important to talk to them too, right? And it's not, you can't just be like, oh, I'm not going to pay any attention to that. Like we need to like help those. I do a lot of harm reduction with like assholes too, where it's like, I'm going to meet you where you're at. I'm not going to give up and I'm still going to like keep fighting for what's right. But like, you know, the more we can bring people along, the more we can teach people where we're at. Like, there are very few people, okay, not very few. The war on drugs began in the late 70s, early 80s. Somebody else can probably cite better dates than me, right? There are few of us around anymore who remember what the world was like before the war on drug users, right? I was born in 81. I don't remember what it was like before the war on drugs because I wasn't born yet. And so I think like as we like, some of it is like, I know I've had to do a lot of work in my life around like taking apart my implicit bias, right? Like we were taught for so long that like people who use drugs are bad, and like unlearning some of those unconscious bias that we have is a lifelong ambition. And some of us are further along that work than others, right? Just as I have to actively work to like dismantle my implicit bias around race, my implicit bias around gender, like it is active work that I'm committed to doing, and acknowledging that there are people who have not yet had a chance to think critically about the war on drugs and like what it does. And so I do think like meeting people where they're at, even if they're kind of assholes, and if they're really annoying and they're like harming my well-being, I'm not talking to them. So I will acknowledge that too. And then the other thing I think is really important is, but I see this a lot, like, I don't know how many shelters I've walked into and been like, someone's going to die in your bathroom, right? Because in designing these public spaces, we have not designed them in a way that acknowledges that somebody's shooting drugs in your bathroom. If you have a public space in our current society where people don't have safe places to use substances and our drugs are poisoned, then so eventually, I mean, hell, I was leaving brunch last Monday and reversed an overdose in my local neighborhood bar, right? Happened to be leaving, saw someone unconscious, luckily had naloxone, luckily knew what to do, but everything turned out fine. Like designing a bathroom with a deadbolt you can't open is not a good plan if you know that there are people who are using in those spaces, right? Thinking about ways that you can like create spaces that build hope and build health and like make it easier for people just to live their lives. Sharps containers, and I spend a lot of time thinking about bathrooms, y'all. But having sharps containers in your bathrooms. One, I know lots of diabetics who also use those containers, right? Like it's not just for illicit drug use. Not having them isn't going to keep people from using drugs in there. It's just going to mean they're going to flush them down the toilet, and then your toilet's going to clog, and it's going to be a very expensive fix. I know, because it happens. You know, and so really like thinking through how we create spaces that are like, if we can't fix it all with our magic wand, let's be really realistic about like who's using our spaces, why they're using our spaces, how they're going to engage with them, and how do we build spaces that help keep people safe.
I just want to piggyback off of everything that Haven and Deborah both said. I guess one thing I wanted to add is around designers and being a part of kind of the harm reduction world that we're trying to build, because all of this is really happening in the container of prohibition. The ideal situation is that we didn't have prohibition, but in the world that we are currently in, being a part of conversations on how to expand the things that we're now starting to have a hold of. So when I think of overdose prevention centers and the limitations with a brick and mortar building, having designers be a part of conversations of making sure that we can have mobile sites and what mobile sites might look like, and really meeting the needs of the most vulnerable in our community. Because when we meet the needs of the most vulnerable, that's the actual trickle down. That actually works in terms of trickling down to making sure that everyone is actually having access. And I think, I'm grateful for, New York City leading the way with, On Point NYC. And I'm really hopeful for what the expansion of that could look like across the country, but it's not necessarily going to look the same in every place. And really expanding on what, revamping a food truck or revamping like trucks or vans to accommodate health services is going to be a big part of expanding harm reduction. And designers are a part of that, especially when we talk about what it looks like to beautify space. Because I think that is something that is super important that is not talked about enough, beyond just drug use and harm reduction in this space. But speaking to what even Deborah said around our schools, and our other facilities. So, I think there's a lot of opportunity in this space to kind of change that and prioritize it. So designers are going to be a big part of that.
Yeah. Wow. Wow.
I just want to say one last thing, Sarah.
Yes, please.
So, how can I put this? I mean, so why I am so committed to policy reform and seeing that as the harm, in part, is because of experience. I lost my uncle when he was 21 to a fatal overdose. That was in 1961. He left a pregnant girlfriend who gave birth to a daughter who never knew her dad. Because my grandmother, his mother, lived in public housing, it was policy. If you had a child involved with drugs, they would kick you out. So she lost her housing. That was in 1961. This is 2021, 22, 50 plus years later, 20, 60 years later. We still have the same policies with the same results. That's not about the people who are using the drugs. That's about us. That's about us. I know that people think of the war on drugs as starting in the 70s, but they were warring on Black people in the 50s. Claude Brown wrote about the slew of young people hooked on heroin in the 50s and 60s when he was growing up. This has been a long battle that's been going on with the same policies. Like Malcolm X said, racism is a Cadillac. They come up with a new model every year. Racial oppression is the same way. The arc has been going on from 1619. It just gets renamed and rebranded, but the results is the same. And so my hope is that for the people who are participating in this event, who are listening to this panel, who are thinking about the future, that they don't think about the future around fixing the present, but they actually think about the future that's about fixing the harms that were built in from the past, that are not about the people today, and that can only be eradicated. It's like you cannot build a strong building on a bad foundation. You got to fix that, and I really believe that for this country, because for me, the essential issue is whether or not we're going to be able to preserve what little bit of democracy we have and grow it. And I believe that that democracy, which is so fragile, was built on a rotten foundation of enslavement and genocide. And that until that is repaired, everything else is at risk. I see a direct result between the movement for reparations and the decline of our democracy. And it's like white folks don't get that if they don't fix this, they don't get fixed. It's not about fixing us. It's about fixing us, the US, us. They're inextricably linked. And so hopefully as we're having this conversation about, what it is about building the future, that people recognize that you cannot step over those things because they're still creating the harms today. And it's only by actually addressing it and making reparations, however that looks, environmental, political, economic, cultural, can you actually build something for the future that'll actually be worth having?
Thank you, Ms. Deborah. I just want to take the time now to express gratitude to you, Haven, to you, Ms. Deborah, to you, Queen, for partaking in this conversation. I think, you know, just the framing of harm reduction is love, you know, like that is such a beautiful way to like, I think, take away from this conversation, and hopefully those that are listening, you know, have these takeaways as well. But thank you so much for participating. You know, we will be answering questions soon for folks in the comments that want to reflect on some of the words that you said. But first, I want to say thank you. And does anyone have any final remarks, anything they want to say before we end the recording?
I'm just thankful y'all are, like that this conversation is happening, right? Like,
Yeah.
I think like talking about how our carceral system is killing people, it is destroying lives and communities, is really important. And of course you can't have that conversation without talking about how drugs are harming that conversation. But like this whole agenda of this whole day has just been phenomenal. So thank you all for all your hard work on that. And Queen and Deborah, I love you guys so much. And thank you for making it smarter and stronger and braver. I appreciate you.
Yeah.
Queen is one of the reasons why I feel hopeful for the future.
All right. Well, I'm going to end the recording. Thank you all.